From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani."
My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning?
When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with sour wine, and put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink. But the others said, "Wait, let's see whether Elijah will come to save him."
Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest.
Then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split.
Yet you are holy and enthroned on the praises of Israel.
The tombs also were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. After his resurrection, they came out of the tombs and entered the holy city and appeared to many.
In you, our ancestors trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them.
Now, when the centurion and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what took place, they were terrified and said, "Truly, this man was God's Son." Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee.
To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame.
John Carlson serves as the lead pastor of Forest Hills Mennonite Church in Leola, Pennsylvania. A reluctant millennial, John is fascinated by the intersections of faith, culture, technology, and tradition. John and his wife are raising 3 young children in Lancaster County, and when he's not chauffeuring his kids around, John enjoys a good cup of espresso, a dense book, or a long-distance run. Please join us in welcoming John Carlson.
So I'm not a very trusting person. Trust doesn't really come easily or naturally to me. Normally I default to suspicion and skepticism. And I've spent enough time in therapy and done enough self-reflection to sort of understand why that is. I grew up in a dysfunctional family. Actually, that's a euphemism. I grew up in an abusive family. So abusive that when I was 8 years old, myself and my 3 siblings were removed from our parents' physical custody by the state and placed into the foster care system. So what that means is that some of my earliest experiences in life, even before I could form conscious memories, were traumatic, teaching me that the world, and more specifically the people in the world, were not to be trusted. So I can make sense of this. But being able to make sense of it doesn't necessarily make it any easier, because our society places such a high value on trust. Trust is woven into the fabric of every layer of our society. Think about handshakes. Do you remember handshakes pre-COVID? This was a thing we did. We would walk up to each other, we would shake hands. Historians speculate that where this came from was a trust-building ritual. A stranger would approach you and you did not know, is this dangerous or not? And so the stranger would extend their hand to show, I am unarmed. I can't hurt you. I can be trusted. And this trust was so valuable, so beneficial to society that long after the time when most of us were carrying long swords around, we continue to shake hands. It's a ritual of trust. There's an anthropologist by the name of Matthew Carey who studies trust both here in Western cultures as well as other cultural contexts. And he says the common narrative, the common story that we tell about trust goes something like this. Whatever it is we value, trust enables it to flourish. Trust, particularly extensive social trust, is variously depicted as enhancing the social fabric, lowering crime rates, increasing happiness, promoting development, generating prosperity, improving one's sex life, and fostering mutually beneficial relationships. Culturally speaking, trust is a hyper good. It's a good thing that makes all other good things possible. At least that's the narrative that we're told culturally. And if this is true culturally, this high value that we place on trust, it is doubly true within the Mennonite church. I did not grow up Mennonite. I did not grow up around Mennonites. And when I first started hanging out with Mennonites, one of the things that struck me was how much they trusted each other. High levels of trust. They would trust each other with their possessions. You need to borrow a car, you can borrow a car. You want to stay at my cabin when I'm not there, you can stay at my cabin when I'm not there. They would trust each other with finances. They would trust each other with their children. Mennonites were so trusting that for a while you all published a book that listed a whole bunch of people's names and phone numbers and home addresses just on the off chance that somebody wanted to show up and stay the night. I don't know what that was, but it was not Mennoniting my way, that's for sure. And so I came into the Mennonite church and had this experience of it being a very high trust environment. And I wondered, will I ever really fit in? Will I really click with these people? Because they trust each other, and I find it difficult to trust anybody. But then I started to get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain. I got to experience life in the Mennonite church outside of just one congregation. First as a delegate to conference assemblies, and then on some conference committees, then as a delegate to national assemblies. And I learned pretty quickly that when you step outside the walls of one single congregation, ain't nobody trusts nobody around here. When you get outside the congregation, there are high levels of distrust. You can diagram this distrust in all sorts of different ways. Progressives don't trust conservatives, and conservatives don't trust progressives. Country mice don't trust city mice. Folks with GC heritage and folks with MC heritage aren't really the picture of trusting relationships with one another. Baby boomers don't trust millennials, and Gen Z doesn't trust anybody over 30. With the possible exception of maybe Peter Frampton. There are like 3 of you who got that joke, and I want to hang out with you when this is over. We can distrust each other for the dumbest possible reasons. I was recently nominated to serve in a church-wide national leadership position, and one of the things that multiple people told me was that I would either be more trustworthy or less trustworthy because I am from the East. Which, first of all, I'm from St. Louis. And second of all, knowing which side of the Mississippi River someone was born on tells you precisely nothing about how trustworthy they are. And so as I began to realize the extent of mistrust and distrust within our community, as we step outside the walls of one single congregation where there might be high levels of trust and begin to relate across differences, and there's very low trust, as I began to realize how little trust there actually is, I had 2 thoughts simultaneously. One was, maybe these actually are my people. And the other was, oh no, we are in trouble. Because if it is true that trust is the thing that allows goodness to flourish, if trust is the foundation upon which we build a good life, then the fact that we don't always trust each other means we are missing out on something good. If the cultural stories we tell about trust and its value and its power are true, then we're missing out on something. So I started to look into this. I started to explore what are some ways that we can build trust. I thought about it among the church. I thought about it for myself. I'm not a very trusting person. What are some ways that I can learn to trust others better? And I turned first and foremost to the wisdom of our Christian tradition, to some of the earliest Christian thinkers, to the folks who composed the New Testament. These fledgling communities of followers of Jesus, I thought there had to be some sort of wisdom there. There had to be something that we could learn about how to build trust, to foster trust with one another. And so I studied the scriptures, looking for encouragement about how to trust one another. And do you know what I found? Nothing. I found nothing. And I was stumped. Because if trust is this hyper good, this good that makes all other goods possible, then surely the earliest Christian communities had to be thinking and wrestling and writing about how do we trust each other. But you read the New Testament, or at least I read the New Testament, and I couldn't find anything. And then a couple years ago, I came across this remarkable book written by a professor at Oxford University. Her specialization is in classical antiquities. So she studies the world in which the New Testament was written and compiled and composed. And in addition to studying the world around it, she studies the New Testament itself. And what she says is, if you want to understand what people in the first century living in the greater Roman Empire, if you want to understand what people thought about trust, you need to look at what they said about faith. Because where we would use language of trust, they would use language of faith. They had words that were almost interchangeable for faith and trust. The Greek word is pistis, the Latin word is fides. We hear echoes of this in our English language today. So someone who commits infidelity has broken trust with their spouse, whereas someone who is an infidel has abandoned religious belief. So we use this same word, fides, this Latin word, to speak both of trust and of belief. But that's on very, very rare occasions in English. By and large, we keep these two concepts separate. Trust is something we sustain with other human beings, while belief is something that is directed toward God. But what this professor at Oxford, her name's Teresa Morgan, what she argues is that we ought to understand the language in Scripture, in the New Testament, the language of faith, as primarily having resonances of trust. Faith is about trust. So I had this aha moment. Because I had been looking for trust and not finding it in the New Testament. But maybe if I looked for faith, I would find ways that we would be encouraged in the New Testament to find ways to build our faith with one another, to become more faithful with one another, to make it easier to have faith in one another. So I went back to the New Testament and I looked and I looked and I looked. And do you know what I discovered as I looked at this faith language about how we can build our trust with each other? Nothing. And now I was super confused. And this is what Dr. Morgan says. She says, we find very few, and arguably no, passages in which Christian community members are encouraged to practice trust toward one another. With the possible exception of one reference in Philemon, we do not find encouragement in the New Testament to trust one another as members of the same community. And this is Dr. Morgan's commentary on this. She says, in the Greco-Roman world and the world of Hellenistic Judaism, the near absence of intrahuman pistis, that's the Greek word for faith or trust, the near absence of intrahuman pistis from Paul's discussion of Christian communities is unexpected and very striking. Then when I read that, even though she was writing in English, I realized I needed to translate it into the kind of English I actually spoke and not academic English. So I'm going to do the same for you. It says, in the context of the Greco-Roman world and of Hellenistic Judaism. So she's saying, in the environments, the socio-cultural context in which the New Testament was written, the near absence of intrahuman pistis, that is the fact that the biblical authors don't talk really at all about humans trusting one another, is unexpected and very striking. Now, unexpected and very striking is a technical academic term that is inviting you to look at something. It's taking something and saying, do you see this thing? Look at this thing, because this thing is bananas. B-A-N-A-N-A-S. This thing is bananas. This is an academic's way of saying what we are noticing right here is bonkers. It is nuts that nowhere in the New Testament are Christians encouraged to cultivate trusting relationships with one another. It's crazy. It is not at all what you would expect. And so it's worth reflecting on. If there is this thing, this absence of a thing in the New Testament, why isn't it there? What's going on? Now, I need to admit that at this point we are somewhat speculating. We can't root these claims in anything in Scripture. In some ways we are arguing from silence, which is always a dangerous thing to do. But I think it's worth reflecting, what are some possible reasons that the New Testament writers and the New Testament communities did not place a high value on being able to trust one another, on encouraging trust in one another? One argument might say, well, trust was a cultural value. Everyone was concerned about trust. Just like we today place such a high value on trust, people in the Greco-Roman world also thought and spoke and wrote about trust a lot. And so maybe the New Testament writers just assumed we don't need to talk about this because everybody already knows how to do this thing. Everybody already knows how to have trusting relationships with one another. But I really don't think that can be the case within the church, because the church was a community the likes of which had not been seen in that culture ever before. It was a community in which people of different classes, different ethnicities, different genders gathered together around table as essentially equals. And nothing in the Greco-Roman culture or literature would have said this is the right way to build trusting relationships across these divisions and boundaries. There, in fact, would have been all sorts of folklore and wisdom and common understandings that relationships like these are inherently untrustworthy. And so it can't be that the New Testament authors just presumed everybody knew how to trust each other. Another possibility could be, well, the New Testament authors expected the world to end very, very quickly. And if you believe that the world was about to end, you would not spend a lot of time trying to do the difficult, time-consuming, painstaking work of building trusting relationships. You wouldn't bother because the world's about to end. That's, in fact, Morgan's explanation for this. But I'm not convinced it's correct, because the New Testament authors go to great lengths to talk about what it means to lead a good life, what it means to lead a moral life, what it means to lead an ethical life, what it means to have relationship in community with one another, relationships that are flourishing. Even if they believed the end of the world was coming imminently, which I think is a debatable point whether they believe that or not, even if they believed it, they still invested tremendous energy in shaping and forming community. So why wouldn't they talk about trust? Here's my idea. I believe that we don't find language encouraging us to put our trust in one another in the New Testament because trust is not the primary foundation of Christian community. Trust is not the primary foundation of Christian community. The primary foundation of Christian community is love. And it is love that is extended even before trust has been established. So if you want to be part of Christian community, if you want to follow Jesus in right relationship with other followers of Jesus, the question before you is not how can we trust one another, but how will we love one another? In Christian community, unlike anywhere else, I believe, in the ancient or modern world, love precedes trust. Love comes before trust. Christians are not called to wait until trust has been established and we know that everything is good, and then we can practice vulnerability and love with one another. But instead, we are called to proactively love people that we aren't entirely sure we can trust. We're called to love people who may be dangerous, to love people who may pose a threat to us. This is the foundation of Christian community, that we love even before we trust. So what is it that makes such dramatic love possible? What is it that makes it possible for people to love one another even when we aren't sure we can trust one another? What is the building block of this love? If love is the thing that allows Christian community to flourish, where do we get the energy, the courage, the strength to practice this risky and dangerous and vulnerable love? What is it that makes love possible? I believe what makes this love possible, this love that precedes trust, is trust. Now, I know you may be saying, John, that doesn't make any sense. I've been at convention almost a week. My brain is entirely scrambled, but I can still tell that that doesn't make any sense. But the trust that makes love possible is not the trust that we build between one another as humans, but the trust that we can place in God through Jesus Christ. Because remember, the New Testament is saturated, absolutely saturated with language of trust. We often translate it as faith or belief, which we tend to assume means thinking certain thoughts in our head about doctrine and ideas. But if Teresa Morgan is correct, and I believe that she is, then the New Testament writers, when they wrote of the faith that we can have in God through Jesus Christ, they were not speaking primarily of having correct doctrine, but having courageous trust in God. The New Testament writers, the earliest Christian communities, believed with all of their bodies and minds and souls that God had demonstrated God's self trustworthy through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I want to see if I can show this to you in Scripture. Because there's this question that hovers over all of our lives, over every aspect of life, because our lives are fragile. Life is often precarious. So it makes sense to constantly ask the question, can I trust fill in the blank? Can I trust my spouse? Can I trust my pastor? Can I trust this church? Can I trust this denomination? Can I trust my bank? Can I trust my kids' teachers? Can I trust that this food that I'm about to eat will not poison me? Can I trust? Can I trust? Can I trust? This question hovers over everything in life. And swirling in and around and through these questions we ask about specific concrete things is a broader question, a question that asks, is God trustworthy? This is the crux of the question. Is God trustworthy? And this question actually comes front and center right in the story of Jesus' execution. Jesus is hanging on the cross in agony, likely stripped naked, the most humiliating death a subject of the Roman Empire can suffer, and people are passing by and they are mocking him. And in the same way, the chief priests also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him, saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel, let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe or trust him." And then listen to this. He trusts in God. Or we could also translate that equally well. He believes in God. He has the right faith. He believes in God. Let God deliver him if he wants to. This is perhaps the most stinging thing that can be said to a person in agony, particularly a person who believes, who has faith, a person who trusts in God. Say, well, if your trust in God is valid, then let God deliver you. Because Jesus had ordered and structured his entire earthly life on the bedrock foundational principle that God could be trusted in anything. And that trust that Jesus had in God empowered him to do remarkable and even dangerous things, but it seems to end here, on the cross, with this question. He trusts God. Let God deliver him. He put his faith in God. He believes the right things about God. Let God deliver him. And what is Jesus' response? Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, that is, my God, why have you forsaken me? It seems that Jesus answers this question that hovers over all of our questions, this question of can God be trusted. It seems that Jesus answers it in the negative. I have been abandoned by God. I have been forsaken by God. God was not worthy of my trust. And theologians have a wonderful time speculating over what exactly this means and what was happening when Jesus said that. And we load all sorts of weight on it about Jesus bearing the sins of the world on himself and God being forced to turn away because of the ugliness of the sin. And perhaps there's some truth to that. But before this was a theological reference, this was a literary reference. Jesus is quoting a song. It's a psalm, in fact. We might call it a worship song. Jesus is quoting from Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then Jesus breathes his last. And it seems like a moment of defeat. It seems that Jesus' trust in God has not been vindicated. It seems that the answer to the question, is God trustworthy, is, at least for Jesus, no. I have been forsaken by God. But that's only the opening line of this psalm. This psalm continues, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, by night, and I find no rest. And this seems to be what is running through Jesus' minds, or at least coming out of Jesus' mouth as he dies. But the psalmist continues, yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In you our ancestors trusted, they trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted, and they were not put to shame. And I believe even though Jesus dies with the first words of this psalm on his mouth, the resurrection is the remainder of the psalm. The glorious vindication of Jesus' trust in God. If there is this thorny question hovering over all of our lives, can God be trusted? Can I entrust my whole self to God? It is as if Jesus grasps the nettle of that question with both hands and Jesus drags it to hell. And Jesus is raised from the dead. He is vindicated for his trust in God. Even beyond the point of death. And what the earliest Christians seemed to believe is that because Jesus had been vindicated in this way, God had been proven trustworthy in all of God's promises, and therefore the doors of trust are open to all of us. All of us can put our trust in God just as Jesus did, believing that God will be faithful to us even beyond the point of death. And this opens up an entirely new world. Because as long as the operative question of our life is, can I trust? Can I trust? Can I trust? Then the logic of our lives will always be, to some degree, the logic of self-protection and self-preservation. And self-protection, self-preservation are not bad things. God desires for us to live and desires for us to live flourishing lives, but self-protection and self-preservation can very, very easily and quickly become the destruction of others. If God is not ultimately to be trusted, then we are alone. And we must rely only on ourselves and our own intellect and our own cunning and our own strength and our own might and our own militaries. If God is not to be trusted, we are alone. But if God is to be trusted, then we can lead lives that transcend questions of self-protection and self-preservation. We can lead lives of faithfulness, even if that faithfulness seems difficult or risky or dangerous. Even if we move into places of extreme vulnerability, we can continue to trust because God is trustworthy. It means that we can live in this world generously. Not because we trust that others will always reciprocate, but because we trust that God will provide for our needs. It means that we can live in this world with hospitality, not because we trust that strangers are always safe, but because we trust that God in Christ has welcomed us, and so we too ought to welcome one another. It means that we can live in this world listening across differences, not because we trust that people who disagree with us get it right, but because we trust that the Holy Spirit will guide us into all truth. We can live in this world peaceably, not because we trust others to be nonviolent, but because we trust God to be present with us even to and beyond the point of death. A life that trusts in God opens up incredibly new possibilities. Possibilities that far transcend the flourishing we think we can cultivate if we trust one another. Because if our hope only lies in our ability to trust one another, then we are still living by the logic of self-protection and self-preservation. I think we actually get a little bit of foreshadowing of this in the story of the cross. We look at the end of what was read for us this evening. Matthew writes, "Many women were also there, looking on from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee and had provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee." I want to focus on this last woman who's mentioned here, the mother of the sons of Zebedee. She's not named in the text. Tradition calls her Salome. That may or may not be accurate. I'm going to use it because I believe she deserves a name. And this is not her first appearance in the gospel. Do you remember the first time Salome shows up? She has gotten such a bad rap for this first story she shows up in the gospel. I personally have preached sermons that have been so deeply unfair to this woman. Because the story is told that she comes up to Jesus and she says, "Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, can my son sit on your right and on your left?" And when I preach this text, I preach it as a text of hubris, of arrogance, of self-aggrandizement. Look at what James and John and their mother were trying to get. They were trying to increase their own stature and standing and status. They were jockeying for position. And perhaps there's some truth to that. Perhaps James and John were jockeying for position. But if you think about this question as a parent, it is entirely possible that Salome was not asking for her sons to be advanced in the world, but simply wanted to know if her sons were going to be safe. This is a question of trust. It's very possible that Zebedee was dead by this point. James and John were all that Salome had in this world. Everything that she held dear, the only sliver of the possibility of a flourishing life for herself. And here they had taken up with this insane would-be revolutionary, who didn't even seem to be that good at being a revolutionary. So her question is a question of trust. Can I entrust my sons in your care? All of us have asked some version of this question. If you have ever had someone you love go into the care of someone else, you have asked a version of this question, maybe out loud, maybe just to yourself. First day, your child goes to school. First day, a parent goes into a retirement community. Or if you've ever had a spouse who needs to go into the hospital. Or even just a best friend who has moved to an unfamiliar town. You have questions of trust. Can I trust that they will be cared for? And perhaps this is Salome's question. She comes to Jesus and wants to know, can I entrust my boys to you? Will you care for them? Can I trust you? And Jesus' answer is, I can't promise you anything. And by the logic of self-preservation and self-protection, that is the end of the conversation. Perhaps even the end of the relationship. If I can't trust you, why would I relate with you? If I can't trust my boys to your care, I don't want anything to do with you. But here is Jesus, stripped naked, executed as a criminal. All of the men have fled. They had put their trust in Jesus to restore the national glory of their nation, and he failed. And so they flee. They flee to safety. They go back to their boats. They want nothing to do with him. And yet, these women are still there. Salome is there. A naked man hanging on a cross being executed by the Roman Empire cannot be trusted. He can do nothing for you. He can enhance your self-preservation, self-protection, self-interest in no way, shape, or form. He cannot be trusted, but she is there. She is there beyond any interest of self-protection or self-preservation. She has transcended the need to look out just for herself, and she is there because she has learned how to love, even if she can't trust. And I believe what we see in Salome is possible for each and every one of us if we are willing to put our trust in Jesus, because Jesus can be trusted. So maybe you're someone like me who doesn't find it easy to trust. And I want to tell you, as hard as it might be for you to believe, for you to trust what I'm saying, I want to tell you that Jesus can be trusted. Or maybe you're someone who finds it pretty easy to trust. You'd list your name in that Mennonite Your Way directory. It's pretty easy to trust as long as the people who are in charge calling the shots look like you and speak like you and think like you and make the decisions you would make. And I want to tell you that you can trust far beyond that because Jesus can be trusted. Or maybe you're someone who finds it easy to trust as long as the circle stays small and control stays pretty high. And I want to tell you that you can trust far beyond that. You can even love your enemies because Jesus can be trusted. I don't know if we can ever bridge this gap of trust that we have within our denomination. But to be honest, I'm not sure that that's our calling. Because we are called as followers of Jesus to love one another, even if we don't trust one another, because Jesus can be trusted. Thanks be to God.